This week is Parshat Blog, and I want to talk about the idea of what happens when we forget. Tara Westover, in her book Educated, for those of you that read it, fabulous book, it's a book that chronicles the story of a woman who she's brought up in this survivalist Mormon home, and she ultimately escapes the claws of her isolationist, rather abusive father to become an educated woman. And the story talks about this idea of self-discovery, of challenging beliefs, of finding one's own truth. But there's a sentence she says there, and I think it's particularly poignant for today. She says, "Never again would I allow myself to be made a foot soldier in a conflict I did not understand." We're seeing so much of this today. People who are foot soldiers in a conflict, they have no clue about what they're even talking about because they refuse to be educated, or perhaps because they don't realize, because social media has numbed their brains, because they've lost the ability to be curious and to ask real questions. And then also to seek nuance in an answer, to understand that not everything is black and white, to see that there is some form of complexity in the very lives that we live. This week's Parsha oscillates between two narratives. One is about a leader whose name we actually only know in a generic way. Paro is the name of all of the pharaohs given the same name in the Torah, who suffers amnesia, forgetting from one plague to the next about what suffering it's caused his people, what his people have endured because of it. His memory of suffering is abated so that he will imprison a foreign people and his own people in a prison of his own egocentric drives, obviously sounding very familiar. This is contrasted with another leader whose humility and self-abasement actually almost costs him his leadership, a leader who's consistently reminds his people to remember, v'zacharta, v'higata levincha b'yom hahu, memory of the moment of redemption and the suffering of slavery is used as a pedagogical mechanism to teach the free people what it is to be free. The message is clear. Individual freedom and liberty is predicated on our ability to ask questions and to answer them, not necessarily through binary, one-dimensional answers, but actually through narrative. People are meant to tell a story because a story houses complexity. A story understands nuance. Questions don't have to have answers. They need to spark curiosity. They need to be part of a dynamic identity building. They need to engender dialogue between different generations. These are the ingredients of true freedom. Postmodernism wants us to believe that absolute freedom is won through the negation of our past, of our identity, of our tradition, of our narrative. One of the facets of postmodernism was the destruction of what they called a meta-narrative, a big narrative. Judaism and the Exodus story protests this idea. Memory, narrative creation, dialogue between the generations, identity formation are the building blocks of freedom because they ensure that we don't make mistakes of the past. They provide a moral compass for the future. We've witnessed the result of postmodernism outlook that has zero regard for the past and therefore fails to learn from its mistakes and repeats them again. And the repetition is getting quicker and quicker. We've witnessed the echelons of leadership who have zero regard for the suffering of their people, and others who have become so convinced of their truth that they refuse to be curious and ask questions that in the end prevents disasters. A few days ago, there was a pigua in Ra'anana, a terrorist attack in Ra'anana. My daughter was 100 meters away, and many of our friends' children saw it all and called the police and Mada while they were watching their friends on the floor and the terrorists running. This morning, a few mornings ago, the school sent messages that the morning after the event, the school sent a message out, both the girls' school, the boys' school, that they were going to facilitate discussion in the class. And I know that many of the children just sat and recounted the story of what happened. They allowed them to cathartically go through the story. They spoke their trauma. They told the story. And I know that many people who have been working with survivors of 710, who have been working with people who were traumatized from the event, say that one of the most important immediate ways of processing the trauma is to speak it through, to start at the beginning and end at the end. That in itself is known as therapy, a therapy that is processing trauma. When we face traumatic events, a way of winning back agency, controlling our reality, is to be able to frame a story. When I get to tell a story, I can break free of the chains of the fate and the conditions that cause my suffering. And when I frame my story as part of something bigger, it endows me with an identity that allows me to transcend the immediate moment of the trauma, places it in the vortex of a much bigger picture. The morning after the event happened, there's a very famous, it's now become famous, video that went out of the Amit High School, of Chomesh High School boys singing outside their school. And they were singing the very famous song, Ha'am Hanetzach lo mefached miderech aruka, the eternal people don't fear the long road. They took the moment of trauma, and what they did by singing that, and by singing generally, is to infuse it with a perspective. They infused it with this idea of them being part of a larger trajectory of their people. It is a brilliant psychological and educational tool, and it's a tool that our forefather Moshe taught his people centuries earlier through the story of the Exodus and during the Exodus. Rabbi Sachs notes that there's no word in the Tanakh for history because history is his story. The word for history in the Tanakh is zikaron, and zikaron is memory. History dies in the past, but memory lives in the present. On Leil HaSeder, we tell the story of our people. We go through a therapeutic process. And in the Gemara, we're told, Matchilim b'nut u'misayamim b'shevach. We begin with disgrace, with the kind of suffering, with victimhood, and we end with praise and gratitude. It's very difficult to be grateful when we're suffering, when we're victims. And so what we do is we tell the story and we learn to reframe. We learn to reframe the story. It's the same story. It's the bitterness and it's the suffering and it's the slavery. But read with a redemptive ending, we're able to reframe it. True freedom, psychological freedom, not just physical freedom, is the ability to reframe my reality, to tell a different story, to be grateful even in a moment of suffering or distress. Moshe is not just teaching the people about freedom in an abstract, kind of pedagogical way, but he's actually teaching it to them in a practical way. That the very intention, the very initiation of the people into the act of storytelling is freedom in and of itself. It's the way that they can move from disgrace to redemption, from victimhood to agency, from being slaves to being people full of gratitude. That act of storytelling is an act of freedom. What we've witnessed in the current moment of Jewish tragedy is that Jewish people worldwide have suddenly reaffirmed the Jewish story. They've understood that they're part of a narrative bigger than themselves. They've found a way to redeem their suffering through telling the story of their people. On social media, in their workplaces, on the battlefield, in their schools, Jews are repeatedly telling our story once again. And in this way, God willing, we'll be able to win our freedom back once more. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, Sorot Tovot, and a healing for everybody that needs it.